Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at progressive revelation in our continuing study of biblical interpretation. The Bible wasn't written all at once. It didn't just come, magically out of heaven all at one point. Rather, God spoke to the prophets at different times and at different places. Chapter 1, verse 1 actually talks about this at many different times, many different places. God spoke to the fathers through the prophets. As he spoke to the fathers through the prophets, not everything that would eventually be revealed in the scriptures was revealed all at once. That means just like we can look at a painting being put together, so likewise the scriptures gradually take shape. We see more by the time we get to Joshua, Judges, and Ruth than we saw in Genesis through Deuteronomy. Likewise, we get down to the prophets, and we see more color added. And like I said, we could liken this to the painting of a painting, in which we start with a bare outline, and then gradually details come into being. So likewise, as we follow the formation of first the Old Testament and then the New Testament, we see more of God revealed, we see more of God's plan revealed, and we see more things about mankind revealed. Now, when we look at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, I often refer to this as prehistory, and I don't mean that it's not historical, but rather there are four major events that are described: the creation, the fall that takes place in the Garden of Eden, the flood in the days of Noah, and finally the Tower of Babel. Those four events take place at a point in time where we can't really assign a necessary date to. We can't say on such and such a date this took place. We just don't know. At least I don't know. I'm not willing to try to hazard a guess. On the other hand, when we get to Abraham, now we can specify the specific dates, so that we have the patriarchs, the period of the patriarchs, beginning around 2000 BC. Now, when we're talking the Old Testament, everything is before Christ. And so we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and then the Israelites go into Egypt, and 400 years later, they're going to come out of Egypt. That's the story of the Exodus. And all of those events, from the prehistory, the creation, all the way up to the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, that's all recorded in Genesis through Deuteronomy, which, according to tradition, and I have no reason to doubt this, was substantially written by Moses. So I have the first 5 books of Moses, all not just taking place, but all written by the time we come to the close of this period. Next, I have Joshua and the book of Judges, and I move now into the historical books. So we talk about the kings of Israel, then the kings of Judah. At the end of that time, you have the Babylonian captivity, but after that, there's a return. And that's the whole of Old Testament history. Now, when it's written, I have the Torah first, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the books of Moses. And so I can consider those with regard to Revelation as all coming forth about the same time. If they're given by Moses, even though he might have had earlier records, earlier traditions that were passed down to him, it's under Moses that we have this take shape into something resembling its present form. Now, I say it that way because there's probably parts of that Moses did not write. For example, the last chapter of Deuteronomy, which records the death of Moses, he probably did not write that. And there may have been, some other parts where a later editor came in and either added or cleaned up the language, or gee, we don't use that word anymore. Here, let me update it. Things like that. There's a place in Numbers where it speaks about Moses being the most humble man in all Israel. I don't know for sure, but maybe Moses didn't write that. Maybe that was added by someone else. Things like that. And yet, substantially, I believe, you have the Torah written by Moses, which means that in Moses' day, he's reflecting on the previous history, as well as in that part where he was an eyewitness, and he's telling us about God and about the world and about God's plan and what God is doing and setting forth the covenant themes. Next, I have the historical books with a number of different authors. But remember, the book, when I'm dealing with a historical book, it always has to be written after the event, sometimes quite a long time after the event. Now, in places this is obvious. For example, 1st and 2nd Kings, which is a united book, even though it begins with Solomon, it ends at the Babylonian captivity, so it has to be written after that, even though parts of it are taking place hundreds of years earlier. So we have those historical books. Now, I'm not finished with the Old Testament. I still have the poetic books, and I put that notice within the period, roughly of the period of the kings. Not necessarily where those things are taking place, because we're not really doing a taking place thing with the poetic books, even though you do have a book like Job that does have narrative. But I'm talking about with its composition. When it is written, it seems to be written during this period. And then I also have the prophetic books, and now I'm speaking of Isaiah all the way through Malachi, the prophets, and they're written not with the beginning of the period of the kings of Israel and Judah, but beginning around maybe 850 BC and all the way to those post-exilic prophets like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So I have the Old Testament written during this period. Now, when I come to the New Testament, first of all, there's the Gospels that talk about the life of Jesus, and then there's the epistles and the book of Revelation that are written, obviously all of it's written after the life of Jesus, but telling the story and then written during that period. So books like Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, now they're all written after the death, burial, and resurrection, because they all mention the death, burial, and resurrection. They might be written, in some cases, considerably after, maybe 10, 20, 30 years, maybe even longer. John sometimes looks like, some people think maybe it was written as late as 90 AD, others prior to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but still it's written, quite a number of years after the events. That's the nature of any historical books. But all four of those books describe the life of Christ. Then I have the book of Acts. Again, it's written after the events of the book of Acts have already taken place, but probably not a long time after those events have taken place. At least, for example, Acts chapter 28 ends with Paul. He's in prison. He's awaiting his trial. And then the book ends, and you don't find out, did he go to trial? Was he released? Was he executed? We're not told, and you probably would have been told if those events had already taken place. So the book of Acts seems to be written very shortly after the very last events of that book. I also have the epistles, nearly all of them. We're not sure about a few, but the great majority of them written prior to 70 AD. Prior to now 70 AD is when Jerusalem fell. So that becomes a very significant event in New Testament history, even though it's not mentioned. It's mentioned prophetically, and certainly it would have been mentioned specifically if any of those writings took place afterwards. And so probably most of the epistles, if not all of them, are written before 70 AD. Then I have the book of Revelation, and notice I put a question mark. We're not sure exactly when it's written. We're also not sure when it was seen. Remember that a book is always written after the event, sometimes a long time after the events. It may be that John saw his revelation earlier. This would answer a number of questions, because internally there's some things that we read about Revelation that seem to put it before the fall of Jerusalem, and yet church tradition has it quite a bit after the fall of Jerusalem, still in the first century. It could be that those events were seen earlier and then John writes them later on. We just don't know. So I really don't want to theorize upon that. Now I want to talk about seeing the Bible covenantally. And so I'm going to speak just a bit about the covenantal history. the idea of a covenant, a relationship into which God enters with his people. And we often start talking about a creation covenant, but the problem in that is that you don't have the word covenant in Genesis until you get to until you get to Genesis chapter 6, which is God speaking to Noah about a covenant. So there's no reference in Genesis to a creation covenant or a covenant with Adam or anything like that. God, even though God gives the land, he does covenant sorts of things with his people. And yet, later on, much later, Hosea chapter 6, verse 7 talks about how, like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. They've dealt treacherously against me. And that suggests that that covenant idea might have been there way back in the days of Adam, even though it's not mentioned in Genesis chapters 1 through 5. You don't see it until Genesis chapter 6. Nevertheless, this idea of a creation covenant and God making a covenant with Adam where you have salvation promised and things like that, those ideas seem to be there, even though the term's not used. And I suggest that because Moses is writing all of that, he's familiar with the covenant idea, and he's describing them in sort of a covenant way, even though he doesn't use specifically the term covenant in those early chapters of Genesis. However, by the time you get to Noah, you do have the term used where God says, I'm entering into a covenant with Noah, and there's a renewal of the land that takes place. It's almost, you have the land given in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and 3 where God creates the earth and then has man who's the ruler over that. And then with the flood, there is man destroyed, and yet at the end of that section, you have a covenant renewal, and I call it a renewal because mankind is again told, go and fill the earth, and he's told, covenant sorts of things as God rebuilds that relationship with him. You get to Abraham, and God again says, I'm making, or actually the proper way to say it, I'm cutting a covenant with Abraham, and you have these covenant stipulations and covenant ceremonies as, again, Abraham has promised the land. Now, he's promised other things too. I'm just mentioning some of the key areas here. You get to the book of Exodus, and by chapter 19, God has said, I'm entering into a covenant with the descendants of Israel, with the children of Israel, as he takes them to Mount Sinai and he gives them the law. And the rest of the Torah, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are given over to that Mosaic covenant, establishing the covenant, their failure under the covenant, that was in the wilderness wanderings, and then the reestablishment is given to the next generation in the book of Deuteronomy as the blessings and the cursings of the covenant are set forth, they're established, and to some degree they're even carried out. Remember, they all die in the wilderness, but then the next generation, that covenant is given to them. When I get later on into the historical books, I see God entering into a covenant with David. And notice we started, in a sense, with all of the world in view, and then there's the family of Abraham, and then the descendants of Abraham, and now a very particular descendant of Abraham, and that's David, who God says, I'm going to make him king over the land. But I get toward the end of the historical books, and that covenant curse comes into effect because Israel has sinned, and they've turned away from God, and the kings have turned away from God, and the king, even David's descendants, like Solomon and like others, who worshipped in a wrong way, and they're removed from the land. And David's descendants cease from being kings, even though at the end of Chronicles, and you see this also in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, they return to the land, and there are still covenant promises, but there's no more king. And the land's much smaller, and yet there's a promise in the prophets where God says, I'm going to make a new covenant with them. And God does that by, when we get to the New Testament, by sending his son, the king, the greater David, the better David, who fulfills the law, all the requirements of the Mosaic covenant, who fulfills the promise that was made to Abraham, and who becomes a better Abraham and a better Israel and a better nation, and through him all the world is blessed, which was the promise that was given to Abraham, and through him he reigns over all the world, and that's the promise that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. And yet this is the king who dies for his kingdom.